All right, welcome back to another episode of Redeemer Unfiltered, a semi-regular, almost weekly, but not quite weekly podcast. So this summer, we're doing a Redeemer Unfiltered series that is going to accompany our Sunday morning sermons. And so on Sunday mornings, we are working through the book of Genesis, but only covering some of the high points of the book. But my hope is that this summer you will read it and study it on your own. You can actually go to our webpage, to the resource section, and download a study guide that'll help you along the way. But we want you to dive deep on your own throughout the week. And so if you're reading all of the chapters, not just the Sunday morning stuff, but all of the chapters, you're going to have some questions. You're going to try to work through some stuff on your own. Maybe need some clarity or there's some things that are confusing. So what we are going to do is in this podcast, we're going to dive deeper. We're going to get into the weeds and we're going to cover a lot of the stuff we just don't have time for on a Sunday morning. And so my hope is that this is a good resource for you in your own journey as you work through the book of Genesis throughout the week. All right, so today we're going to cover chapters 1 through 11. All right, so it's a pretty big stroke here to take, but we want to cover these chapters, and then that'll set us up for this is kind of following the sermons. So this will set us up for the next sermon to be through these chapters. All right, before we jump into that though, let me give you a little bit of background. Genesis is a book about beginnings. It tells us that God created everything that exists. It shows us how God is both the creator and ruler of all creation, but it also tells us of humanity's tragic fall into sin and death. And we see God's unfolding plan of redemption through his covenant with Abraham and his descendants. Right? So here's a question: who wrote the book? If you were at one of the services on Sunday, I misspoke and said Noah. It was Moses. All right, Moses, not Noah. There's a joke, I don't know if you, or a riddle, I don't know what you'd call it, where someone says like, how many animals did Moses bring onto the ark? And then you're like, 2 of every kind. And then it's like, it wasn't Moses, it was Noah. Lots of people get this confused. So I misspoke. If you heard on Sunday that it was Noah, it wasn't Noah, it was Moses. All right, so who wrote the book? It was Moses. He did so about 1,400 years before the life of Christ, when Israel had escaped enslavement to Egypt, and as they were in the wilderness headed towards the promised land, he writes the first 5 books of the Bible, beginning with the book of Genesis. So who's it written to? The book is written to God's people. And another question is, well, what is this book about? And so while I would say while it is written to us, it's not primarily about us. All right, so yeah, there's a lot of stories in here that have moral lessons and examples for us to follow or examples for us not to follow, and we can really apply it to our lives. So I love the application of Genesis, but it's not primarily about us and what we are supposed to do. It's primarily about God and what he has promised to do through his son, Jesus Christ. And so we're going to see Jesus throughout the whole thing, which is going to be absolutely beautiful, right? And so at the end of the day, what is Genesis about? It's not about us. It's about Jesus, right? And so the next question is how should we read the book of Genesis? So as you're reading this book, do you read it like a science textbook? Do you read it like a magazine that you pick up at the gas station? Do you read it like a Harry Potter novel? How should you read the book of Genesis? Well, something I want to make sure that we're doing as a church is when we open the Bible, I want us to read the Bible literarily, not literally. Right? So here's what that means. We want to read with an understanding of the literary genre of the text. And so in Genesis, we're going to find a bunch of different genres. Some of Genesis is narrative. Some of it is poetry. Some of it is just covering genealogies and kind of giving legal record. So there's different types of genres, but we would say like you don't read lyrics from a Taylor Swift song the same way that you would read information from the newspaper. And you're not reading a newspaper the same way that you're reading a classic novel. Like different literary styles have different ways of reading them, right? And so Genesis is no different than that. It was written to an ancient Near Eastern people, and we want to take that into consideration as we are studying this book. So let's read it in its literary style. Now, how is Genesis broken down? And this is one of the reasons we're going to cover chapters 1 through 11 today is I would say you could really break it down into two main parts, chapters 1 through 11, and then chapters 12 through 50. And so in chapters 1 through 11, we see God calling creation into existence, and we really see how sin fractures everything. So we see what goes wrong with God's good creation. Then in chapters 12 through 50, we see God calling his people into a relationship, but we also see God's plan begin to unfold on how he's going to fix what all was broken, starting in Genesis 3. All right, so chapters 1 through 11, and then chapters 12 through 50. So, first chapters, you open up your Bible and you're reading chapter 1. It really, the first section would go from chapter 1 all the way to chapter 2, verse 3. And so what that covers is the first 7 days of creation. Chapter 1 covers 6. The first 3 verses of chapter 2 covers the 7th. All right, so what are some of the big takeaways in that first chapter plus 3 verses? One, we see that Genesis is more concerned with God as the creator than it is concerned about the details of creation. So, I mean, there's obviously way more complexity and things that God could have done or could have worked, or there's a lot of how and how long type questions that we could have. But Genesis just doesn't seem to be concerned with answering the how and how long questions as much as it wants us to understand that God is the creator, that he created intentionally, that he created purposefully, and that he is present in his creation. It wasn't by some type of cosmic explosion that was an accident. It was God's divine design throughout the whole thing. So as you read verses 3 through 31, you're coming to the 6 days of creation, and like I said, some of Genesis is poetic. And so what we're seeing here is there's poetry, but just because it's poetry doesn't mean it's not communicating a literal truth, right? So don't hear me say this is poetic and then go like, oh yeah, so this isn't real. It's like, no, you can still convey literal truths through poetic means. But what I mean by the poetry there is it has all this symmetry where days 1, 2, and 3 parallel days 4, 5, and 6. And so in day 1, God separates light and darkness. And then on day 4, kind of paralleling day 1, he fills the light and the dark with the sun, the moon, and the stars. On day 2, God separates sky and the water. And then paralleling day 2 is day 5, where he fills the sky with birds and he fills the water with fish. From here, we get to day 3, which parallels day 6. And so on day 3, he separates the dry land from the water. And on day 6, he fills that dry land with animals, but also with man. All right. So as we think about this, there's some questions like, okay, like Jeff, are these literal days? Like, are they 24-hour periods of day like we experience? Or were they epic eras of time? I mean, like we read in 2 Peter that what to us seems like a day could be 1,000 years to God because it's outside of time. And so is this just an epic era of time? And so if each day is an epic era, not a literal 24-hour period, does that make room for the evolutionary process? I mean, when we look at the earth, I mean, science tells us that it's old. Like, so is the earth old or is it relatively young? Like, when we look at humanity, like, are we relatively young or have we been the part of a process that's taken 4.5 billion years to come to? Like, all these questions, like, so what is the Christian view on this? And so I'm not going to show my cards today, but I would say, like, I want us to understand that there are 5 different views that you're going to encounter. And in these views, I want us to be a church that can have thoughtful and respectful dialogue. I don't want these views to become divisive and create tension within our church that's unnecessary, right? Because I said, Genesis doesn't seem to be so concerned with answering the how and how long as much as it's trying to communicate that God is good. He intentionally created, and everything that he created was good, even very good, right? So what are the different views? One view is called literary framework, right? So the literary framework view would say that nothing about the creation account is to be taken literally. So they're like, like there's no literal stuff being taken here. It's just God using poetry to communicate a singular truth that God created. All right. And so to take any details from these chapters to be literal would be a misstep to the author's original intent. That is the literary framework. All right. The next view would be called theistic evolution. Right? In theistic evolution, when it says day, they would say it's not referring to a literal 24-hour day, but a long period of time. So the earth could be 4.5 billion years old. And in this view, over the course of these billions of years, God was guiding an evolutionary process where humans were eventually formed. But they didn't become human until God breathed life into them with his spirit. And so the first being that looked like a human being from the evolutionary process, when God breathed life into him, that would have been Adam. The second one would have been Eve, and then there would have been others as well. And so this view would say, like through an evolutionary process, we got to a certain point until God breathed life into us, and that's when that process ended with humans. All right, so that's theistic evolution. The next is intelligent design. Intelligent design is a lot like theistic evolution in regards to the day being long, epic eras of time. But what makes this position different is they are not saying, the intelligent design position does not believe God guided an evolutionary process. Instead, they would say that God intelligently designed humanity as a specific kind. It never evolved from one kind to another kind. It was always God's intention, like, hey, I'm creating humans. So he's creating different kinds, but he's not creating kinds that are shifting into other kinds through adaptations and mutations, et cetera. So you've got literary framework, you got theistic evolution, you've got intelligent design. Another position is called young earth and young humanity. And so in the young earth, young humanity, they would say these days are literal 24-hour periods, and that the universe is about 10,000 years old. So relatively young, 10,000 versus a billion. Big gap, right? So that's a young earth, young humanity view. And then there's also what's known as an old earth, young humanity view. It's a little more complex to understand or to unpack, but to try to simplify it is that what God created in verse 1 existed for an undisclosed period of time. So God creates everything in one fell swoop in verse 1, but it was uninhabitable. And so this uninhabitable place could have existed for a split second before he gets to work, or it also could have existed for billions of years. It's just saying we don't know. The time is undisclosed. And so that makes room for the earth to be old. It also makes room for the earth to be young. But young humanity says, even though that verse 1 makes room for an old earth, that when it comes to humanity, these days are actually literal days, and that God is creating every day. So he creates man in a day, not over the course of time. And so this would say that humanity is very young, right? And I think that most historians would look at the way that the human race is and say like humanity as we know it is young. It's just a matter of, did we come through an evolutionary process or not? All right. So those are 5 positions that you might encounter. All right, literary framework, theistic evolution, intelligent design, young earth, young humanity, and old earth, young humanity. And I would say, if you want to do a deeper dive into this, you're going like, I'm in. One is, I'll say it. When I was in college, I was a theistic evolutionist. And so I thought if I wanted to have any credibility in the scientific community to help them know Jesus, that I needed to adopt an evolutionary view, but I kind of found this cushion where it's like, well, yeah, I believe in evolution, but I believe in theistic evolution. And so in that, to try to better understand evolution, when I had electives, my GPA suffered because of this. But when I had electives, my buddies were taking scuba diving, weightlifting, basketball, and getting just easy A's. I was like, I'll take the biology of animals as an elective because I really wanted to dive deep into this stuff, right? And so if you're like, hey, I want to dive deeper, I want to know creation, man, you could, there's endless amounts of things you could explore, but I think a helpful book just to dive deeper into these different views that are held within Christianity, pick up a copy of Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology book. what I enjoy or what I like about Wayne Grudem in this is that he presents each view with honesty. So he doesn't build a straw man where he like makes one view just super easy to tear down and make you feel stupid for ever believing it. Like he provides it in a way that you're like, I bet this is where he stands. Until you read the next description and you're like, oh, this is where he stands. And the next one you're like, well, because he's just honestly painting a picture of what these views are. And what you'll see is that no matter what view you take, you're going to be held accountable to something, right? Like none of these views make perfect, complete sense, which is totally okay because Paul in the letter to the 1 Corinthians says that until Jesus returns, we're always going to know only in part. And so our knowledge of this is partial, which means we don't fully understand it. But that doesn't mean it's wrong to dive deep and to do your best. All right. So if you want to go deeper, Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology book has a great chapter on this stuff. All right. Some other questions here. Were Adam and Eve the first human beings? Or were they just literary devices and poetic images? And so is this just poetically saying Adam as humanity or are these literal people and were they the first people? So to that, I would say if you look at the genealogy of Jesus in the book of Luke, it intentionally relates Jesus all the way back to Adam, which would make us believe that Adam was the first human being. Jesus talks of Adam being a real person in both Matthew 19:4 and Mark 10:6. And then the whole logic of Paul in Romans 5 and 6 hinges on Adam being a real person. One real person brought sin into the world, and one real person can take it away. So without Adam and Eve, the Bible loses its basis for the fall, for sin, and for our need for redemption and our need for Jesus's atonement. And so I would say that Adam and Eve absolutely were the first human beings. All right, moving on. Chapter 2, starting in verse 4, all the way through chapter 4, verse 26. Chapter 2, from this point forward, zooms in on day 6. And it gives us more details on God's creation of Adam and Eve as God's unique image bearers. And one of the big takeaways is that they had no shame because there was no sin. All right, but in chapter 3, all of this changes. Sin enters into the world, and as a result, shame comes over Adam and Eve. And so the consequence of sin is death. And so as you're reading the account, and it's like, hey, if you eat this fruit, you're going to die. They eat it. So in verse 7 of chapter 3, you're thinking like, why haven't they died yet? Kind of thought they would just like bite the dust and croak right there. Well, death is twofold. It's spiritual and physical. So spiritual death is a broken relationship with God, right? While physical death is the process of returning back to dust. And so spiritual death happened in an instant upon their sin. Physical death became something that they would face, but didn't immediately enter the picture of their lives, right? So yes, they immediately experienced spiritual death, but they would eventually experience physical death. In chapter 4, we see how sin entering into the world sets a trajectory of things progressively getting worse and worse. First case scenario, Adam and Eve's sons, Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel, right? Like murder enters into the picture because of the sin that Adam and Eve brought into creation. A question that you might have is like, why did God have regard for Abel's offering but not Cain's? All right. If you heard that drink and you're listening to this audibly, I just took a drink of something from a can, so sorry about that. So why did God have regard for Abel's offering but not Cain's? And here's how I'd explain it. Abel's gift was from a thankful heart. And what I mean by that is this was not contractual. He expected nothing in return. He simply loved God for God. So when Abel makes an offering, he's not like, I'm going to do this so God will bless me. I'm going to do this because if I give this to God, then he'll owe me a favor. Like there's no contractual thoughts behind this. It's like, because I love God, I want to give him my first. I want to give God my best. Cain's gift came from a transactional heart. Right? His heart was totally different. He expected God to honor his gift with greater blessings. In other words, he didn't love God for God. He loved God for what God could give him. And so that different heart, the thankful heart versus the transactional heart, is the reason that God gave regard to Abel's, but not to Cain's. All right, from here we get into chapters 5 through 9. All right, so from Adam to Noah, corruption on earth just continues to get worse and worse. I mean, things are not going well. So in chapter 5, this is kind of a genealogy, like Adam's descendants to Noah, and you read it, and it's like, and this person died, and this person died, and this person died, and this person died. We kind of get bored and like our eyes gloss over, and like, can we just get on to the good stuff? But I think about it, the way that the original readers would have read chapter 5 is, think about how many people get into their genealogy. They're like, where is that from? Do I have any Irish in me? Am I Scottish? Am I like Italian? Am I Mexican? Like you get into your heritage, you start looking into it. And so you can do like 23andMe, or you can go to ancestry.com, and you can do all this work to try to figure that out. That same way that people today care about where they came from, and kind of get into following their family trees, that's how the original audience would have read chapter 5. It would have been interesting to them, right? And so what's interesting though is, I think what we see here is that for most of us in life, like we're gonna be born, we're gonna live our lives, and we're gonna die, and so that's okay. The most important thing in that time, like, so if we don't have some radical lives that change the world, like, does that matter? The only thing that matters is seen with the life of Enoch, because it says that Enoch walked with God. Right? It doesn't say he died. It says he walked with God. So the question is as you live your life, are you doing so walking with God? That's the most important thing. All right. So in chapter 6, we start to get to some really fun questions. All right. Like, who are the sons of God? Who are the Nephilim? And so when it comes to the sons of God, there's some different views here. Let me give you 3. One view is that the sons of God are the godly line, or the descendants of Seth, who are now marrying from the ungodly line of Cain. And so you kind of see, so after Cain murders Abel, the next son that Adam and Eve have is Seth. And so Seth's line is going to be godly, Cain is going to be evil. And so could the sons of God be that, like, hey, these are sons of Seth that were supposed to be from the good line, but now they're starting to intermarry with Cain and his evil line. So that's one view, that the sons of God are the godly line of Seth. Another view is that these are angels who came down to earth and began to hook up with human women. And then others would say, like, I think the sons of God are just heroic kings of other nations, people like almost thought were like demigods, kind of like Moana. Is that the movie where you have the rock? Anyways, so I've got that song in my head. Anyways, all that to say, those are 3 positions for who the sons of God are. The next question is, like, well, who are the Nephilim? Like, are they the offspring of angels that impregnated the women? So, like, if angels hooked up with earthly women, like, were their offspring the Nephilim? That's one view. Another view is that these are angelic beings who are on earth in human form. And then a third view is people would say, like, these are just giants, really big people who existed before angels and hooked up with women, and they exist after angels hook up with women, and they have nothing to do with being their offspring. It's just like they're just really massive, tall, Andre the Giant looking folk. And so I would say the most scholarly work I've seen done on this topic. So this gets into the details of cross-referencing this language throughout the rest of Scripture, and so. But the most I'll just give you the cliff notes. All right. So the most scholarly work I've seen done on this concludes, and I'm not saying this is the right view, but I'm saying this is just this seems to be the most intellectually honest view. Would say that the sons of God were angelic beings who came to earth and hooked up with human women. Right, so that I think that's where we would see these sons of God are angelic beings who came down and they had relationships with human women. But when it comes to the Nephilim, it seems that these are just incredible kings who people thought must have been half human and half divine for the type of feats that they accomplished. And so Moses mentions them as a footnote to show how they were merely human. So he's just saying, like, hey, and even the Nephilim, like you think these people are demigods, you think that they're half human, half God, but even the Nephilim are going to get wiped out by this flood. So they're just a footnote. So that kind of seems to be the most intellectually honest view, is that yes, the sons of God are angelic beings, but the Nephilim are just incredible kings that accomplished great things that people thought, man, maybe they're half human, half God, but they weren't. They were just regular old human beings like the rest of us. Another question in these chapters is like, all right, what about this whole like only living to be 120 years old thing? Like, can anyone live longer than 120 years? Like, I bet if you Googled it, you'd probably find like this person lived 121 years. Like the Bible is no longer reliable. Like I would say it does seem curious that most people don't seem to live past this age, right? Like, but has someone ever broken 120? Probably. I would say the 120 years is most likely referring to the gap between when God said he judged the world through a flood and when the flood actually occurred. And so as people are living for much longer during this point in history, that God's saying like, hey, like no one's going to live past 120 years. Like you've got 120 years that I'm going to be patient, that I'm going to give you a chance to repent, that I'm going to give you a chance to turn to me, that I'm going to give you a chance to walk in obedience. But after that 120 years, the patience ends and judgment comes. And so I believe the 120 years is referencing the time between God's announcement of judgment and judgment actually coming. So could be wrong. Who knows? All right. From here, we see the increasing corruption leads to the flood, where God begins with a fresh slate. But the corruption of sin is actually not a physical condition, it's a heart condition. So the flood doesn't change human nature, which leaves some questions like, if the flood didn't change anything because of sin in our hearts, then why would God do it? Why would, if it's not going to accomplish any purpose of like resetting the stage, like why do it? And I would say that one of the ways I make sense of this in my own heart is that it was really intense. Like it was a pretty harsh punishment where God wiped out the earth. But here's what's crazy: if God wiping out the earth didn't fix the problem, and it like that harsh of a thing did not fix the problem, then maybe it would require something even more harsh to truly fix it. And so when the cross comes along, and the cross seems extremely harsh, it's like, well, actually, like if the flood didn't do it, it would take something greater, and the cross is greater than the flood. But so I think this is actually foreshadowing the cross. We'll come back to that in a little bit. All right. So some other questions with this is like, Jeff, do you really think the flood happened? Right? Do you think this is real? And so Jesus talks about the flood as an actual event in Luke 17:26. So I believe the flood actually happened. And one of Jesus's closest friends, Peter, talks about the flood as an actual event in 2 Peter 2:5. Another question is was the flood global or local? Like, was the flood really the whole world, or was it just kind of localized to this region? And so what's interesting is if we live in East Tennessee, if you go over to Carter County, Doe River Gorge, take the train up the Tweetsie Trail headed towards Boone, the rocks have like these crazy waves to them at one point, and apparently some archaeologists have come in, and geologists and people that study this stuff, and they're like, the only way that these rocks could be shaped like this would be a massive global flood. So it's like, did it happen? Was America flooded? I would say here's what I'm confident of. It could be as small as the spread of humanity, because the goal of the flood wasn't to destroy all of creation. It was to wipe out sinful people. And so I'd say it would have to be big enough to cover all of humanity. So as far as humanity had spread to this point, the flood would be at least that big. So it's as small as the spread of humanity, which would still be a massive flood, but it could also have been much bigger, actually covering the whole world. So was it global, local? It was big enough to wipe out all of humanity, period. Right? And so those are some questions that arise in these chapters. So after chapter 9, we get to chapters 10 and 11. And so after the flood, Noah's sons begin to populate the earth. They're fruitful, they're multiplying, and they turn into other nations, which gets us to chapter 10. Once again, more kind of descendants that we see. Not interesting for us, definitely interesting for the original readers. In chapter 11, verse 1, this is just something I would take note of. It says, and the whole earth had one language and the same words. A question that came up last time we went through a Bible reading plan was like, were there no other languages up until Genesis chapter 11? And I would say like what we know of Genesis chapter 11 is that there at least was a singular language that was distinguishable from all nations, from all people. But that doesn't mean that there couldn't have been like some like insider language that some of these nations had. So just because there's one language that everyone gets doesn't mean there aren't potentially other languages that would just be understood between certain people groups. So, but either way, there is one universal language. And so with that, we have the question so with that's the one language question. But also something that's interesting is in chapter 11, we read about this place called the land of Shinar. And so what I think is interesting about the land of Shinar is that the story in chapter 11 is the Tower of Babel. This is where God confuses all the language, where there's no longer one universal language, where people don't understand each other anymore. And so Babel, so the land of Shinar is where Babel happened. Then, as you get to the book of Daniel, right, which is a prophetic book later in the Old Testament, it says that Daniel was brought to the land of Shinar. So where was he brought? Well, this was during the Babylonian captivity. So what we see is that the land of Shinar, which is where the Tower of Babel happened, eventually becomes Babylon. And so I think it's really neat to see how that unfolds. That like the land of Shinar that was present in chapter 11 is present later with the nation of Babylon. All right? You're like, where's that at? That would be like near Baghdad. All right, so that's where Shinar is, near Baghdad. But like I said, people were trying to build a new Eden without God in the picture. They're trying to get to God without God's help. They're trying to remove their need for God and this desire to build the tower to get to heaven on their own. And that's when God comes down and is like, the world is continuing to spiral away from the way I intended it to be. And so that's kind of like chapter 11 just ends just with kind of a low note. It's like, man, are things ever going to get better? I mean, like it's sin entered the world in chapter 3. Cain kills Abel in chapter 4. God floods the earth. Now we have the Tower of Babel. It's like, are we ever going to learn? Are things ever going to change? And that really sets the stage for chapter 12, which we'll get into next week. And so will things get better, or is just the world doomed from here on out? And so there's good news. We'll see that next week. But what I want you to see today as we close out is that Genesis chapters 1 through 11 is ultimately all about Jesus. I mean, Jesus is the better Adam, where Adam and Eve had everything they could possibly want in the Garden of Eden and still fell into temptation. Jesus was in the desert lacking all the things that he needed, nothing around him that would make life comfortable. And Jesus, where Adam and Eve failed with everything at their disposal, Jesus, in a much darker place, doesn't give into temptation. So he succeeds where Adam failed because Jesus is the better Adam. I would say that Jesus is the better clothes. So when God clothes Adam and Eve with animal skin instead of fig leaves, Jesus doesn't just cover our skin. Let me read this. He's the better clothes, not merely covering our shame, but taking our shame away. All right. So Jesus clothes us now with his righteousness, which doesn't just cover our shame. It takes the shame away. He's the offspring of Eve who will crush the serpent's head in chapter 3, verse 15. He's the better blood, like where Abel's blood cried out for Cain's condemnation. Jesus' blood cries out for our salvation. Jesus is the better Noah, where Noah climbed into a wooden boat to save his family. Jesus climbed onto a wooden cross to save all of humanity. And Jesus is also the better Tower of Babel, where the Tower of Babel signified humans striving to get to heaven. Jesus is the true and only way, which means heaven isn't something we can earn from what we do. It's something we must receive through faith in Christ and what he has done. So at the end of the day, chapters 1 through 3, they're all pointing us to Jesus. All right. So hopefully between now and our next podcast, you will have downloaded that study guide, follow along with us week 1, week 2, week 3, do that reading, and then we will dive deeper into more chapters next week. Thanks for tuning in.